In this video I want to cover the three most basic CSS selectors: type or tag selectors, classes, and ID selectors. I feel it's important to do so because even experienced web designers don't always follow the basic principles. This video will also help you understand my approach to working with CSS. Type selector is the official name used by the CSS specification, but Dreamweaver calls it a tag selector, as I suspect many web designers also do. That's because a tag or type selector redefines the basic styles for an HTML element, and the selector is made of the element name without the angle brackets. A type selector styles all matching elements. A class selector has a name that begins with a period, like this float left. It applies to elements that have the class attribute in the opening tag, and it can be used multiple times on the same page. An ID selector has a name that begins with a hashtag or a pound sign. It applies to elements with the same ID attribute and can be used only once on a page. Now let's put all this into practice. This is a completely unstyled page. I've already attached a style sheet, but as you can see, it contains no style rules at all. To start with, let's change the font in the paragraphs. Select a paragraph here and switch to the CSS mode of the property inspector, and I'm going to select a font here. Let's choose Trebuchet MS, and this launches the new CSS rule dialog box. Dreamweaver has analysed my selection and suggests this rather complicated selector, but it's much more efficient to set the font on the body tag to style the whole page. So I'm going to change from compound to tag, and not P, I'm going to use the body. And I want to set the rule definition in my attached style sheet, so select the style sheet there and click OK. And you can see that what has happened is that the font has been applied to the whole page rather than just to a paragraph or to several paragraphs. Next, I'm going to make some changes to the way that the headings look. So I'm going to put my cursor inside the main heading and select it in the tag selector here. And I'll select this align center icon here. And Dreamweaver has again suggested a particular type of selector for me. I don't want it to be wrapper H1. I'll make it less specific. And click OK. And there we are, we've centered the main heading with a rule for H1. But rather than have the same font for the heading, I'd like to have the headings in both a different color and in a different font. If you look down here, the targeted rule is now H1, but I don't want to create it just for H1. I want to affect all of the headings, H1, H2 and H3. So I'll select New CSS Rule, and then I'll change the font to Georgia. Again, going to make it less specific, and then add in H2 and H3. So this grouping selector will affect all three types. So you see that all of the headings are now a different font. And if I change the color here, that same rule has taken in the color, so all the headings are changed at the same time. In the underlying HTML, I've created divs with IDs for main content, wrapper, and also for sidebar. So I need to create some rules for these to move them into different places. If I select div wrapper in the tag selector and then go to the CSS styles panel, I can click this new CSS rule icon at the bottom here to open the new CSS rule dialog box, and it automatically gives me wrapper. So I click OK, and that opens the CSS rule definition dialog box. And what I'm going to do here is go to the box category and give it a width of 960 pixels. Deselect the same for all checkbox with margin and make the top margin 0, the right margin auto, the bottom 0 and the left auto. So that will give me a wrapper which is 960 pixels wide, which is centered in the page. Click OK. If I go into full design view and collapse you can see that it's now centered. Let's expand the panels again, and I'm going to put my cursor in here and then select Div Main Content and click New CSS Rule. I don't want it to be within the wrapper. Main content on itself is fine, so less specific, and then click OK to open the CSS Rule definition box and go to Box, Float Right. And when you float something, you need to give it a width, so I'm going to give it a width of 660 pixels and click OK. And what we've done is we've created the main content floating right, and the sidebar has now moved up into the gap that has been created. I just want to give the sidebar a width of its own so that it isn't quite so wide. So div sidebar, new CSS rule. Again, make it less specific. Always use the simplest possible selector to achieve the ends that you want. Now click OK, and I go to the box category and make the width of that 260 pixels. OK, so there we have it. The page is beginning to look a little bit better. I'm now going to insert a couple of images. Put my cursor at the beginning of this paragraph, go to the Insert panel, select Images, go to the Images folder, and select that one. I won't bother to give it any alternate text, you should always do so. And another image down here. Now we need to float the images to the left so that they fit in nicely with the text. Click the new CSS rule icon at the bottom of the CSS Styles panel. Dreamweaver has made a suggestion, but I'm going to ignore that, and select Class and create a class called Float Left. It doesn't matter whether you put the period at the beginning of the class name in the new CSS rule dialog box. If you leave it out, Dreamweaver will automatically insert it for you. Click OK, and again it's the box category, Float Left. We'll change the margins. We'll give it a top margin of 3, a right margin of 8 pixels, bottom margin of 3, and we want it flush with the left, so we'll make it 0. Click OK, and then I can apply the class to the image that I've got selected by opening the class menu in the property inspector and choosing Float Left, and you see it's floated it quite nicely. Do the same with this one here and float left. So if we just look at that in live view, the page isn't perfect, but it's beginning to look a lot better. And if you look at the CSS styles that I've created, it only uses simple tag selectors or type selectors, an ID selector, and a class. Browsers treat the HTML markup in web pages like a family tree, and Dreamweaver helps you visualize the relationship between elements through the tag selector at the bottom of the document window. If I click inside a paragraph in the sidebar, you can see the hierarchy in the tag selector. We've got the body at the top, then the wrapper div, then the sidebar div, and finally the paragraph. Now if I move into the main content div, you can see that the hierarchy is different. We're still within the body and wrapper, but now we're within the main content. You can use this family tree relationship to select specific parts of the page for styling. All elements nested inside another at any level are regarded as descendants. You create descendant selectors by putting a space between the two selectors. The ancestor goes on the left and the descendant on the right. Let's create a descendant selector for the sidebar paragraphs. So I'm going to put my cursor inside a paragraph there and click the new CSS rule icon at the bottom of the CSS Styles panel. And you'll see that Dreamweaver has analyzed the hierarchy and it's suggested this descendant selector, wrapper sidebar P. Everything in the page is inside the wrapper, so I don't need to be quite as specific as that. Click less specific, and I've now got a descendant selector for sidebar P, and the new CSS rule dialog box actually analyzes what your rule is going to do. So I'll click OK to go into the CSS rule definition dialog box, and I'm just going to change the font style from normal to italic and click OK. And you can see that all of the paragraphs inside of the sidebar have been turned italic, but in the main content they remain unchanged. I'm going to switch now directly to the style sheet, and here is that descendant selector that has been created, sidebar P. I'm going to put my cursor between the sidebar and P and insert a greater than sign, and then put the focus back into design view. And you can see what has happened now is that the paragraph which is inside a block quote here is not styled. Using the greater than sign between two selectors means that the selector on the right must be a direct child of the selector on the left. I've got my cursor inside the block quote paragraph, and you can see in the tag selector here the hierarchy: body, wrapper, sidebar, block quote P. So we're inside a paragraph, but it's not a direct child of the sidebar. That's why it's not affected by this style rule. Using child selectors speeds up the loading of your page because the browser doesn't need to keep going down the family tree to find matching elements. The downside is that they're very specific, and they're not supported by Internet Explorer 6. However, they are supported by Internet Explorer 7 and later. I'm going to create another child selector, this time for paragraphs in main content. And I'll set the text indent property to 40 pixels. If I go back into design view, you'll see that the paragraphs in main content are now indented by 20 pixels, but the paragraphs in the sidebar have not been affected. The rule that I've just created also affects the paragraphs that immediately follow the H2 headings. I don't really like that, so I'm going to create another selector. Let's do it directly in the style sheet. We'll start off with main content. Create a child selector for H2. And then CSS has a rather strangely named selector which is called the adjacent sibling combinator. What this does is it targets an element that follows immediately after another one. What I want to do is I want to affect the paragraphs that immediately follow the H2 elements and no other paragraphs at all. And to create an adjacent sibling combinator, you add the plus sign. So plus P, and then I'll set the text indent to 0. And if we go back into design view, you'll see that what has happened is that the paragraphs are adjacent siblings. In HTML and CSS terminology, sibling refers to elements that are at the same level of the page structure. So adjacent siblings are nested inside the same parent element and immediately follow one another. The second paragraph is also a sibling of the H2 heading, but it doesn't follow it immediately, so it's not affected by this adjacent sibling selector. Let's take another look at the selector. Now it looks quite complex, but it's also very efficient because it only looks for paragraphs that immediately follow an H2 heading that are direct children of the main content. Selecting elements based on their relationship to each other within the HTML hierarchy offers great power without the need to use classes, keeping your markup clean and easier to maintain. Unfortunately, child selectors and the adjacent sibling combinator aren't supported by Internet Explorer 6, but as its market share continues to diminish, you can begin to add them to your CSS toolbox. One of the first CSS techniques that most web designers learn is how to style links using the link, visited, hover, and active pseudoclasses. They're called pseudoclasses because the class isn't applied through the class attribute. The browser applies the class dynamically, depending on whether the mouse pointer is hovering over it or not. It's important to use the pseudoclasses in the right order for the styles to be applied correctly. Many people remember the correct order using the mnemonic love-hate, LVHA. Although they get that right, time and again I see inefficient styles being used for links. Let's open the style sheet and I'll show you what I mean. Here the font family, font weight, colour and text decoration have been added to each of the pseudo classes. Now that's totally unnecessary because the cascade will take care of that type of thing. It's much more efficient to rationalize them. I'm going to create a basic rule for all links using the A selector and set the font weight to bold and text decoration to none. That'll now apply to every link in the page. I can get rid of the font family because that's already been declared in the style rule for the body up here. So let's get rid of it from the link and from visited, from hover and from active. This generic rule for links has already set font weight to bold, so I can get rid of that too. And text decoration to none, so I can get rid of that here. So all we're left with in the link pseudo class is the colour. In visited, I'll get rid of bold. I need the different colour, but I don't need text decoration. With hover, get rid of bold. I need the colour. I also need text decoration, which will need to change to underline. Now with active, I'll remove the font weight bold. And you can see that what's left is the same colour and the same text decoration as hover. So rather than have two separate rules, let's combine them in a group rule. And we can get rid of that there. So now we have a rationalized and much more efficient set of style rules for the links. Let's just save the style sheet and see what the page looks like in a browser. When I hover over the links, they look exactly the same as they did in live view, so it's working fine. The other thing is that many people who suffer from motor disabilities can't use a mouse, so instead of mousing over links, what they do is they use the Tab key to move from link to link. If I press the Tab key, you'll see what happens here is that I've got a dotted rectangle around the link. Now a lot of designers say, oh, I don't like that, that really destroys my design. But there is a way around this problem because there's another pseudo class which is called focus. Let's just go back to Dreamweaver. What I'm going to do is to add the focus pseudo class to my hover and active rule. This ensures that when the link has focus, it will look exactly the same as though you are hovering over it with a mouse. So what you can now do is set the outline property to none. Let's just save the style sheet again and test it in a browser. I'll need to reload the page. So when I tab to the link, it looks exactly the same as if you were hovering over it. I'll hover over this one and then press the Tab key again, and it's moved the focus to this second link. So as long as you make sure that your links look different when they have focus, it's quite safe to remove the outline property and get rid of that focus rectangle, which a lot of designers find unpleasant. Now let's make the link in this second paragraph look different from the first paragraph. Back into Dreamweaver. If we look at the original HTML code, you can see that this is in a div with an ID called different. So I need to create descendant selectors for the links in the different div. Rather than waste your time while I type everything out, I've got them in my clipboard, so I'm just going to paste them in here and save the style sheet, go back into live view, and you can see that the link is styled differently. It's a very simple technique. Let's just go out of live view here. Something that you might find useful, which is a little bit of a hidden secret within Dreamweaver, is the style rendering toolbar. Go to the view menu, and then it's right down at the bottom in toolbars and style rendering. And this style rendering toolbar has the pseudo classes here. So if I click the V here, it shows me in design view what my links will look like in the visited state, and again with H for hover state, A for the active state, and F for focus. A useful little tip there. So that's the link pseudo classes. Unless you're creating a game where hunting for the links is meant to be part of the fun, make sure that your links stand out and are easily identifiable. And don't forget the focus pseudo class to make your site accessible to visitors who use the keyboard to navigate around the web. In this video I'm going to demonstrate the first line and first letter pseudo elements. The CSS specification describes pseudo elements as abstractions about the page structure beyond those specified by the document language, and in the case of a web page, that's HTML. Don't worry if it sounds as clear as mud. To show an example of what it means, let me change the width of the document window. As I move it narrower and wider, you can see that the text is reflowed. So there's no way in the HTML markup to indicate the first line of a paragraph. But it's very easy to style the first line using the first line pseudo element, which has been part of CSS since the very beginning, so it's supported by all current browsers. Let's open the style sheet, and I'll create a style rule using the first line pseudo element to display the first line of each paragraph in uppercase. We need the text transform property and set it to uppercase. And if I refresh the design view, you can see that the first line of both paragraphs has been turned into uppercase. And if I resize the window, you can see that the first line is in uppercase, but the length of the line is constantly changing, and so the letters that are in uppercase are also constantly changing. To apply this style to just the first paragraph, I'm going to use an adjacent sibling combinator with H1 and P first line. And you'll see that now only the first paragraph has its first line in uppercase. The other pseudo element that I want to talk about is first letter, to create a drop cap. Of course, you could wrap the first letter of a paragraph in a span tag and assign it a class, but using the pseudo element avoids the need for unnecessary markup. I'm going to apply it just to the first paragraph, so again I'll use an adjacent sibling combinator, H1 plus P, and then the first letter pseudo element. And I'm going to make the font size rather big, 48 pixels. And if I refresh design view, you can see that the first letter of the first paragraph is now much bigger than any of the other letters. So I can continue styling it, adding padding, floating it left, margins, background colour, to make it look a more attractive drop cap. To save time, I've copied most of the styles I'm going to apply to my clipboard, so I'll just paste them in here, and we'll look at it again. Now it's disappeared in design view, so if I turn on live view you can see the effect. What I've done is I've added some padding, I've floated it left, given it a little bit of margin on the right hand side to move it away from the text, given it a background colour, and changed the colour of the text itself to white. That doesn't look too bad, but to make it look a little bit more attractive, I'm going to add a few CSS3 flourishes. To do that, I'm going to go into the CSS Styles panel and select All, and then select the H1 plus P first letter style rule, and then add Property. Open that little menu, and I'm going to select Text Shadow. And this gives me a little icon which I click to bring up the options for text shadow. Now, because I'm in live view, what I want to do is to see the effect of the text shadow as I apply it. So rather than going for the first options, I'm going to choose the colour. And I'm going to choose the colour as being black. And the X offset says how many pixels I want the shadow to be horizontal. The Y offset is how much I want it to be vertical. I'm going to make it just a couple of pixels, and it might be difficult to see in the video, but it's actually making the text begin to pop out. Just click away from there. Next, let's give that background some rounded corners. So I'm click Add Property again and go to Border Radius. This gives me the same icon which I click to get the properties. And I'm going to leave the border radius being the same for all and make it, say, 6 pixels, I think. Yes, that's quite a nice little effect. Click away. And how about a little drop shadow on that box? Dreamweaver Live View doesn't yet support the box shadow property, so you need to switch to Category View in the Properties pane of the CSS Styles panel. So I'll just click the Category View icon, which is the first one on the far left at the bottom of the CSS Styles panel. And I need to go to the WebKit category and find, I'll need to expand that just to see the property names. There we are, WebKit Box Shadow. And the same, I'm going to select the colour first. I'm going to make the colour black, but I'm going to change the colour format to RGBA so that I'll be able to add some alpha transparency to the colour afterwards. And I'll select black. And don't want a very big shadow on this, so I'm going to make the X offset 2, the Y offset 2 pixels, and then give it a little bit of a blur for 3 pixels. Now, as you can see, that's a rather heavy colour that we've got there. So I'm going to go directly into the style sheet, and I'm going to manually edit the RGBA value. The first 3 values, RGB, red, green, blue. The last one is the alpha transparency. And I'll change that from 1 to 0.3. Go back into Live View, and it's given me a rather delicate box shadow on the background. To ensure that border radius and box shadow work in all browsers, I need to add the vendor-specific properties as well as the regular properties, so I'll just quickly do that. Now that I've added the vendor-specific properties to the style sheet, I'm going to save it and view the page in 2 different browsers. This is what it looks like in Google Chrome. As you can see, the style for the first letter pseudo-element is correctly applied, but the first line pseudo-element has been ignored. And this is how Firefox has done it. It's applied the styles for both pseudo-elements, but look at the difference in the way that the first letter has been styled. Same style rules, browsers treat them differently. So using first line and first letter pseudo-elements on the same paragraph doesn't work reliably cross-browser, and also first letter can be difficult cross-browser too. So you shouldn't mix them if a uniform appearance is important to your design. Nevertheless, they're useful tools that can come in handy from time to time. Attribute selectors were introduced in CSS2, but lack of support in Internet Explorer 6 prevented their adoption. So what is an attribute selector? it matches an attribute in an element's opening tag, and optionally matches the attribute's value or part of the attribute's value. And it's been supported by all browsers since Internet Explorer 7. The basic attribute selectors look like this. In this example, LM represents the tag name and ATTR represents the name of the attribute, which goes between a pair of square brackets. Putting the attribute name in quotes is optional. This type of attribute selector matches regardless of the attribute's value. Then ATTR equals some value matches if the attribute has that exact value. Again, it doesn't matter if you put the value in quotes. And finally, inserting a tilde between the attribute name and the equals sign matches if the attribute is a space-separated list of values that contains an exact match for some value. That might be a little bit difficult to understand in theory. It's better to see it in practice. This page contains 3 images, but the second image doesn't have an alt attribute. So what I'm going to do is create an attribute selector which will put a border around images that have got an alt attribute, but it will ignore any image that doesn't have one. So go into the style sheet and create the attribute selector img, open square bracket, alt, close square bracket, and then we'll set it to have a border which is 5 pixels, and we'll choose a color for it, make it 900, which is a sort of dark maroon, and solid. And you can see that I've now got a border around the first image, but not around the second, and there is a border around the third image. And that's purely and simply because those 2 images have got alt attributes. The second image doesn't have one, so therefore the style is not applied to it. Targeting an attribute with a specific value has many practical uses. The styles for this form include this style definition for label, which makes the label 100 pixels wide and displays as an inline block. If I turn on live view, you'll see the effect that it has. What's happened is that this one is too long, and so it's scrunched up within the 100 pixels. So I'd like to create a special rule simply for this particular one. So if we go into the HTML code, you can see that the label is for terms. It uses the for attribute, and the value of the attribute is terms. So I need to create a style rule for label, open square bracket, for equals terms, close square bracket, and then the width I set to auto. And if I refresh live view, you'll see that that one particular label is no longer constrained by the 100 pixel width. Now let's say you want to increase the width of the text input fields. If you create a style rule for the input tag, let's see what happens. Input, width, 250 pixels. And refresh live view. And you'll see that what has happened is that it's affected the radio buttons, the checkbox and the submit button, forcing the submit button to be far too wide, and also moving the labels for the radio buttons and checkbox out of position. However, we can solve this by using an attribute selector for type equals text. So if we just change that, type equals text, and refresh live view, everything is back to normal. I think you'll find that using attribute selectors that look for an exact value extremely useful. Not quite so useful is the attribute selector that looks for an exact match in a space-separated list of words. Just to give you an example of how it works, let's look at this page here, which is a copy of the earlier page. And if you look at the title attributes, we've got the word fish in this one and fish in this one. So it's a space-separated list of words. So it can create a selector that looks for any title that contains the word fish in a space-separated list of words. So img, open square bracket, title, tilde equals fish, close square bracket, and then we'll give it a background color of FF9, light yellow color. And there you see that we've now got a background color for the two images that contain fish in the title, but not for the other one because it doesn't contain fish. I don't find this attribute selector particularly useful, but it's available if you need it. Here's a reminder of the 3 attribute selectors covered in this video. To my mind, the most practical is the second one, which matches an element that has a specific attribute and value. I find it particularly useful for styling forms. The selectors I'm going to show you in this video are part of CSS 3, but they're very widely supported. In fact, Internet Explorer 7 has supported them since 2006. I think you'll see that 2 of them are extremely useful. They match a substring or part of the value of a specific attribute. Let's take a look at how they work. Here, LM represents the tag name. You place the attribute name between square brackets followed by a caret or circumflex before the equals sign. This matches attributes that begin with the specified value. Putting the value in quotes is optional. In the next one, instead of a caret or circumflex, you place a $sign before the equals sign, and this matches if the attribute's value ends with the specified characters. And the final one, you place an asterisk or star between the attribute name and the equals sign, and this matches if the attribute's value contains the text anywhere within the attribute value. So let's see how they work in practice. In this link, the href attribute begins with HTTP. That means that it's an external link. So I'm going to create a selector that looks for external links. Switch to the style sheet. So we'll add a open square bracket href caret or circumflex equals http close square bracket, and then we need to put some properties in there. So background image, and I'll browse for that to the images file, and I've got a little icon here, external link PNG, which I'll select. That will be our background image. We need to make sure that it doesn't repeat. So background, repeat, no repeat. And the position, we'll put it background position. Right, center. And to make room for the background image, a little bit of padding. Padding right, 15 pixels. That should be fine. So if I now go into live view, you'll see that what has happened is that we've got this little icon after the external link. But this is an internal link, as is this. So neither of those are affected. It affects only links where the href begins with HTTP. In other words, external links. PDF files are often very big, so it's a good idea to warn users that they're about to download a PDF. So what I'm going to do is to create another selector that looks for links that end with .pdf. So a href. This time it's a $sign that I use before the equals sign. Because I'm going to use the file name extension, which begins with a period, I need to put the value in quotes this time. So insert quotation mark, period PDF, and a close quotation mark, close square brackets. And then add the properties. Again, I'm going to use a background image and position it. So if we refresh live view, you should now see that there is a PDF icon after the link to a PDF file. We've got the external link icon there, but this link, which doesn't go to a PDF file or to an external page, is not affected. I find the selector that matches a substring anywhere in the value of an attribute is perhaps less useful, but to demonstrate how it works, I'm going to hide any image in this page that contains the words or contains the letters Japan. We've got here Japans and Japanese, but the first one doesn't contain the word Japan anywhere in the title. So if I go into the style sheet and we'll do img, open square bracket, title, star, asterisk, equals Japan, and set display to none. Refresh live view, or in fact doesn't even need to be live view, we're in design view now, and you can see that the other two images have gone, but the one that doesn't have the word Japan anywhere in its title remains. So it's more versatile than looking for an exact match. To recap, there are three attribute selectors that look for a partial match in an attribute's value. Matching the beginning or end of a URL is particularly useful for applying a different style to external links or links that download a file. Internet Explorer 6 is the only common browser that doesn't support these selectors. It simply ignores them, so you can use them to improve the user experience for the vast majority of visitors to your sites. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. The name is important because styles cascade or trickle down both through the structure of the web page and through the style definitions. Having a good understanding of the cascade and a principle called specificity is essential to maintaining your sanity when trying to fathom out why a style rule doesn't work as expected. Dreamweaver's CSS Styles panel can help you greatly in this respect, but first let's recap how the cascade works. There are three sources of styles: the browser, the web designer, that's you, and the user. Each successive one takes precedence over the other. So you as the web designer can override the browser's default rules, but the user can also override yours. It doesn't happen very often, but it can, so you need to be aware of it. Inheritance is also extremely important in CSS. Text properties and list styles are inherited, but most other properties, such as margins, padding and background, are not. Inherited properties build on top of each other. For example, there's no need to specify the font family in every style rule if it's already been defined for an element higher up the document structure. But you can override inherited properties in more specific rules. for example to apply a different font family to page headings. But what happens when two rules conflict with each other? The general principle is that if both styles have equal weight, the style that comes lower down in the style sheet takes precedence. But the problem is that not all selectors are equal, and that's where the principle of specificity comes in. The official way of calculating specificity uses 4 numbers separated by commas. To work out a style rule's specificity, you add up the values of each part of the selector in each comma-separated group. These examples should make it a little bit clearer. In the first one, there's an ID selector and a type or tag selector. So the ID gets a value of 1 in the second group, and the P gets a value of 1 in the fourth group. The second one is a descendant selector with 2 type selectors, so that gets a value of 2 in the fourth comma group. And the final one, you've got an ID and 2 type selectors, so you get 1 in the second comma group and 2 in the fourth comma group. If your head's hurting at this stage, I don't blame you. The official way seems to be overly complicated, and although it is the official way, most web designers ignore the commas and treat the values like this. Inline styles get a value of 1,000, so they always take precedence. IDs are treated as having a value of 100. Classes, pseudo-classes and attribute selectors have a value of 10, and type selectors and pseudo-elements come at the bottom of the heap with a lowly value of 1. So taking the examples again, the first one has a value of 101, the second one has a value of 2, and the third one has a value of 102. So if you're trying to style paragraphs inside a block quote, and it doesn't work, it could be because the paragraphs are inside an element with the ID sidebar, so you would need to use the last one to override the second. Let's see that in practice. In this page here, I've got a block quote with a paragraph inside it. And in the styles, I've created a style rule which is block quote P, font style normal. But as you can see, the font in the block quote is actually italic. And that's confirmed by the CSS Styles panel, which tells me that the properties for my current selection are determined by sidebar P, and the font style is italic. If we look here in the middle section, which shows us the cascade, you can see the block quote P is listed here. Let me just select that, and there's a line through font style. That indicates that it's being overridden. And if you mouse your cursor over there, you can see a tooltip which tells you that font style does not apply to the selection because it's been overridden. Tooltips in the middle section also tell you the specificity. You can see the specificity of sidebar P is 101, whereas of block quote P, it's just 2. So to solve the problem, we need to create a selector that is going to overrule block quote P. So we need to add the ID selector in front of it. If I now refresh Design View, you can see that what has happened is that this has now taken precedence because it has higher specificity. There's one final technique for overriding rules with greater specificity, and that's to add an exclamation mark followed by the keyword important after the style definition. This is not recommended. It's inefficient because you need to add it to every property in a rule. You can't apply it to an entire rule block. It's far better to master the rules of specificity, and the Dreamweaver CSS Styles panel can help you greatly in this regard.